They've gone through, Paul and Silas have, Syria and Cilicia, strengthening of the churches. That's the last verse of 15. And now what cities does Paul come to? Derbe, Lystra, and then in verse 2, so he's going Derbe, Lystra, Iconium. That's backwards from the way he hit those towns on his first journey. Wonder why? Yeah, he's coming from the other direction. So he hits them in reverse order. Makes sense when you realize that. And in Lystra, he finds this disciple named Timothy. What do you know about him? Yes, his mother was a Jew who was a Christian. His father was evidently a non-Christian Gentile. So he was a half Jew, half Gentile. As such, he'd never been circumcised. And Jewish boys were circumcised the 8th day, but because he had a Gentile father, he had not been circumcised. What did Paul have him done to him?
Had him circumcised?
Yeah. Now, maybe I need to say, and we'll talk about this more in a minute, Paul chooses to take him with him. I think Timothy's going to be the successor for the John Mark, kind of the junior one to the two partners. But Paul, before he takes him, has him circumcised. Now, I thought we just settled that. That you don't have to be circumcised. And then Paul turns around and circumcises Timothy. What's going on with that? I don't believe he circumcised Timothy to save him, or because he thought he had to be. But a half Jew who's not circumcised will alienate and turn away any opportunity to teach Jews. So trying to become all things to all men, he circumcises Timothy. As long as he's just doing this as a cultural thing, it's not wrong. Circumcision is wrong. It just should not be insisted upon as a condition of salvation. So Paul was unyielding in the principle. In Galatians 2, when they wanted Titus to be circumcised, who was a Gentile, Paul said no, he wouldn't yield to him. But when there was no question of legalistic brethren trying to bind an unnecessary requirement, then Paul asked Timothy to be circumcised so that it would not present a barrier when he was evangelizing Jews. Now, what else do you know about Timothy in verse 2?
I have a question.
Yes.
How in the world would they know he was circumcised?
I assume that that's something that people told them. It's kind of, an important symbol. I mean, I don't know. Some things seem rather off limits to us to discuss. I wouldn't talk about that much, even us, even though the majority of American males probably are circumcised. Several aren't. It's kind of gone back and forth among the doctors. But in Brazil, it is very common to ask and answer questions about taking permanent measures to prevent pregnancy. I remember going to one home in Brazil, first time I'd ever been there. And, it's the same word for female surgery as it is for making a phone call. And this woman asked me what she meant was, had she taken permanent measures to have no more children? Now, we just wouldn't ask that or talk about that until you knew somebody really well. That's considered kind of private. But in some cultures, obviously in theirs, it's not. People do talk about it very openly. And so it may be that was kind of an open discussion. You were circumcised, and therefore you were a full Jew, or you weren't, and therefore you were kind of alienated. That's the only thing I can imagine. I doubt that they tried to verify that. But what else about Timothy in verse 2? He was not just well known, but
people spoke well of him.
Yeah. He was well thought of. He was well regarded by the brethren. They really thought he was a good man. And so Paul selected him partially on the basis of the good reputation that he had among the brethren. I've taught this here, I think, and certainly more than once. But one of the things that's impressive to me about Timothy, besides just the character that he has, he's mentioned in 10 of Paul's letters. He's also mentioned in Hebrews. And he's also mentioned in Acts. So I think he's mentioned in 12 of the books of the New Testament. Pretty central character. And a good man all the way around. But the thing that impresses me is how young he was. You wouldn't know that from this, necessarily. You might assume he was younger, since he was kind of taken on as a trainee, maybe. But, wow. In 1 Timothy 4, in verse 12, Paul tells him, let no man look down on your youthfulness, but be an example to the believers. I don't know how old you thought Timothy was when Paul said, don't let anybody look down on your youthfulness. But I will tell you, Paul wrote that probably 11, 12, 13 years after this. In 2 Timothy 2, Paul says, flee youthful lusts. And he probably wrote 2 Timothy a good 15 years after that. And they told him to flee youthful lust. So Paul still considers Timothy susceptible to youthful lust 15 years later, and still considers that people could look down on him for being so young maybe 12 years later. So I doubt that Timothy was 40 when he was taken by Paul, don't you? Probably not even 20. I'm assuming he was a teenager. And yet, was willing to accompany Paul on a risky journey. Remember what had happened to Paul in Lystra? He got stoned. Timothy surely knew that, may very well have been a witness to that. Paul trusts Timothy a lot, even early on. He's using Timothy. And so I just think, we underestimate. We tend to make excuses for us. I'm just young. I can't do anything for the Lord. Yes, we can. We ought. The Lord is willing to use people of any age, and so Timothy goes with Paul.
Didn't Paul say, doesn't he call Timothy his son, right?
Yes.
Like their bond is so close.
Yes, he does. In 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy both. No, actually, Philippians 2, he also calls him a son. But yeah, he just meant a son of faith.
That's what
He calls Titus that also. I think one of the passages actually says, my son in faith. Yeah, the 1 Timothy 1:2 to Timothy, my true child in the faith.
Okay.
So if he was 30, 12 years before, 12 years after, he'd have been 18 here. Maybe he was 28. And so he was 16 when Paul started. But, I really think this pushes Timothy's probable age back to somewhere in the teenage range.
Okay.
And then he can be like 20s to 30 or so when Paul was saying that. That's my guess.
Yeah.
I can't prove that. Doesn't make a lot of difference. There are times we know of spectacular service to the Lord among young people where we can nail down the age. And Joseph was sold into slavery at 17. We know David was evidently quite a young man when he killed Goliath. We don't know exactly how old. We suspect Daniel was a teenager when he made the stand against the food. We know Jesus was 12 in the temple. It's not, we know Josiah was about 16 when he started seeking the Lord. Okay. So we've got several things we can nail down. If Timothy's older than that, so be it. But I really think he's probably, quite young. And just, it's an inspiration to younger people to aspire to be a Timothy.
When you said that they went to Iconium, he was well spoken of in Lystra and Iconium. But where did it say that he went to Iconium?
Good point. It doesn't specifically say that, but I'm assuming for him to know that he was well spoken of by those brethren, he would have gone.
Okay.
But that may be not an absolutely certain assumption, although his whole goal was to revisit the churches they'd established, so you would assume he did. Yeah, good point. I appreciate you bringing that up. Now, as they're passing through these cities, they are delivering the letter. They're telling the people about the decrees from the Jerusalem apostles and elders. And the churches are strengthened and increasing in number. So they're doing a lot of good here as they're going back through these churches, strengthening and encouraging the brethren. Okay, how about 6 through 10? Very unusual. They're going through Phrygia and Galatia, and what does the Holy Spirit do in verse 6? Yeah, told him not to preach the word in Asia. Whoa, that's not what you're expecting. And then verse 7, they're trying to go to Bithynia, and what happened? I can imagine them wondering why so many promising locations for evangelism are being denied to them. Here they have a plan to go here. No, you can't preach there. Want to go there? No, you can't go there. Why not? Isn't the gospel supposed to be spread everywhere? And so, really, they don't have any place else to go. They just go straight across the Troas. Only way the Lord let them go. I'm sure they were really puzzled over this. Their plans have been frustrated. What's going on? And then suddenly, Paul has a vision one night. What is it? There's this man saying, please come to Macedonia and help us. And immediately, they realize that must mean God's called us to preach the gospel to them. Now we see what was going on with that. God's not going to let Paul be distracted, not even by preaching the gospel, from reaching Macedonia, where he wants the gospel spread next. Isn't that interesting? You never know when a setback may be a blessing. If you really wanted to preach the gospel somewhere and the Lord just didn't let it happen, You can be really frustrated, like, man, why can't I do this? Why can't I go there? Sometimes people wanted to go to some country and preach it, and their visa's denied. What do you do in a case like that? Do you just say, oh, the Lord's going to do that to me, I'll quit preaching? The Lord had other plans. But the Lord sometimes does that. We can't get discouraged. Just keep doing the work wherever the Lord sends us. It may not be where we had in mind to go. Once we see what happens in Macedonia, I think here it becomes clear why God wanted Paul there. Now, did you notice something that happens in verse 10? We get our first we section. In verse 9, a vision appeared to Paul in the night. A man of Macedonia was standing and appealing to him, saying, come over to Macedonia and help us. And when he'd seen the vision, immediately we sought to go into Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. So putting out to sea from Troas, we ran a straight course to Samothrace, and on the day following to Neapolis. So what does that mean when he suddenly jumps from he and they to we? If you say we, what's the difference between talking about them and talking about us?
Now you're included in that.
Yes. Us means me too. So we is including the author. They, or he, is not including the author. I take it Luke joined the group in Troas and went over to Macedonia with him.
So is this the first reference we have to Luke in Luke? Or in Acts?
Yeah.
Wasn't there some similarities like with that Theophilus? I forget, how do we know that Acts was written by Luke too?
Well, that's one thing. It was both Acts and Luke were written to Theophilus.
Okay.
And in Acts, he makes reference to the first account that he'd written to Theophilus about the things Jesus began to do it to.
Oh, it makes reference. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
By the way, we will lose our we section when we leave Philippi. What would that mean? Luke stays in Philippi. And remarkably, that's where we'll pick him up again, in Macedonia. Philippi was in the province of Macedonia.
Oh, okay.
So, most people think that Luke stayed and helped the church of Philippi. 11 to 15.
Therefore, sailing from Troas, we ran a straight course to Samothrace, and the next day came to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, which is the foremost city of that part of Macedonia, a colony. And we were staying in that city for some days. And on the Sabbath day, we went out of the city to the riverside, where prayer was customarily made. And we sat down and spoke to the women who met there. Now a certain woman named Lydia heard us. She was a seller of purple from the city of Thyatira, who worshipped God. The Lord opened her heart to heed the things spoken by Paul. And when she and her household were baptized, she begged us, saying, If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay. So she persuaded us.
Now, when Luke is with Paul, especially when he travels by sea, you almost have a port-by-port travel log. You'll notice that some other places. Where if Luke wasn't there, you just said he went from here to here. But now that Luke's with them, they go from Troas, straight course to Samothrace, next day to Neapolis, from there to Philippi. It's more detailed. I'm assuming Luke had a diary or something. And he's referring back to it, and he's, mentioning the ports that they stopped at on their way. Philippi was a first-rate city in Macedonia, and they stayed there for some days. And where did they go on the Sabbath day? Yeah, because that's where some women were there assembled for prayer. Where did Paul more commonly go when he went into a new city? Synagogue. Wonder why he didn't go to the synagogue in Philippi.
Really?
Apparently there wasn't. I think he would have otherwise, and these women would have been in the synagogue on the Sabbath day had there been a synagogue. Apparently Jewish custom was that you had to have 10 men residing in a city to make a synagogue. It may not have been 10 Jewish men. But these traveling women, and some others perhaps, were there by the riverside praying, and Paul started speaking the word to them. And there's this one woman named Lydia. Where was she from?
Thyatira.
And Thyatira was basically in the province of Asia. So that's interesting, isn't it? Paul wanted to preach to Asians, but the Holy Spirit sent him to Macedonia instead, where he converted Asians. Of all things, the Lord knows where his people are. And that is kind of an ironic thing. First person he finds in Macedonia was a person from where he wanted to preach, who wouldn't have been there if he'd have preached there. Isn't that amazing? What do you know about Lydia?
Seller of purple.
Yeah, she's a woman of the cloth. Not the way we usually talk about that. She sells purple cloth, which was a very expensive dye. Purple cloth would be very expensive. And so that's what she does. She's a businesswoman. She's there in the city of Thyatira. She's listening, and the Lord opened her heart to respond to the things spoken by Paul. What did God use to open Lydia's heart?
The things spoken by Paul.
Sure. This is a response to the gospel. Paul's preaching unlocks Lydia's heart and draws her to him. And she does. She responds. She heeds what Paul said. Wonder what that means. You know, what happens if somebody's heart is open and they respond to what Paul taught? Well, I'll tell you what happens when she responded to what Paul taught. Verse 15, when she and her household had been baptized. I'm going to say something subtle here, so you may understand this and you may not. But by saying it that way in 15, and when she and her household had been baptized, it's not like he's giving us new information. To say when she did that is to say you already knew that. How did we already know that? Well, she opened her heart to respond to the things spoken by Paul. Then certainly she was baptized, and he says when she was. So he's suggesting that her baptism was implied in what he'd already said. If she opened her heart to respond, she was baptized. We already knew that. Now, when she was baptized, she urged us to stay with her. This passage shows that baptism is a part of opening your heart to respond to what Paul says. And so then she wants them to accept her hospitality, which they do. Does that speak well of her? She just obeyed the gospel, and she's already opening up her home to this company of preachers. That's really encouraging. Paul will later say in Philippians 1:5 that the Philippians had fellowship in the gospel with him from the first day until now. So there's the first day. Already Lydia's opening. The very day she was converted, she shows hospitality to him. It's really impressive.
I think it's kind of weird, because if you look at it, they're sitting there praying by the river. And it's kind of ironic that, that may be where they're baptized.
Good place for Paul to have encountered them, isn't it? Good point. Absolutely.
I didn't even think of that.
I hadn't thought about it either, but that's a good point. The Lord works everything out, doesn't he? Actually, the particular province in Asia that Thyatira was in, you won't believe this, it was the province of Lydia. She was Lydia from Lydia. Maybe why they called her Lydia. But you know how sometimes you'll call somebody Texan or Tex, come here. Maybe she may have been that's why she got it. Or maybe they just wanted to name her for the province that she was born in. I don't know. But it is kind of an interesting feature.
She didn't just sell the color purple.
She sold the fabric.
The fabric that is purple.
The dye fabric. Yes, it was very expensive.
I didn't know she just sold the dye, like the color, Or
I think she probably sold the fabric.
Okay.
Maybe even some purple clothing made from the fabrics. I'm not sure about that.
Okay. I didn't know if there's New American Standard or anything.
It says she was a seller of purple fabric. Products of purple, fabrics, perhaps even clothing. How about 16 to 18?
As we were going to the place of prayer, we were met by a slave girl who had a spirit of divination, and brought her owners much gain by fortune-telling. She followed Paul and us, crying out, "These men are servants of the Most High God, who proclaim to you the way of salvation." And this she kept on doing for many days. Paul, having become greatly annoyed, turned and said to the spirit, "I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her." And it came out in that very hour.
So here you've got this slave girl that has the divining spirit. She's a fortune teller, and her masters are getting rich off of her. And she cries out after Paul and us, Luke and the others, saying, "These men are bond servants of the Most High God, who are proclaiming to you the way of salvation." Is that true? Do you want a slave girl fortune teller declaring this about you? It's kind of like today. I mean, would you want to be recommended by a gangster or something that way? This is not going to be very good. She keeps bribing them. I don't know what she was like, But I remember this woman in Ipiau on one of my trips. She was all decked out in all sorts of lavish, outlandish clothes. And she comes prancing across the street and starts talking to us and talking to each one of us and, more or less out of her head. And, oh, wow, it was just like unnerving almost. And she just wouldn't let us go. She was just parading around us and whatever. And it's like, what would you do? I can just imagine she's possessed by a demon. So she probably is a little weird. It was annoying. What does Paul finally do? Cast out the demon? And it came out of her at that very moment. You might notice the first part of verse 19. We'll look at this in a minute. But when her master saw that their hope of profit had come out. It's the same verb. The very moment the demon came out, their source of income did too. Can't prove this. But I'm assuming this. Let me put it this way. When Jesus healed demon-possessed people, what did they do? Follow him. I'm assuming that's what she does. It doesn't explicitly say that, so I wouldn't stake my life on it. But I think that's probably what the implication is. If you think about that, then, who were the initial converts we know about Paul having in Philippi? Lydia, demon-possessed slave girl, and a Roman jailer. Those would be the first three that we know about. Now, the rabbis thank God every morning that God didn't make them a Gentile, a woman, or a slave. Who are the first people in Philippi to receive the gospel that we know about? Woman, slave girl, and a Gentile. The gospel crossed more than just the Aegean Sea when it came into Macedonia. It crosses gender barriers, social barriers, and ethnic barriers. You're starting to see the little group in Philippi take shape. You've got Lydia and her household. You've got the next slave girl. You've got Luke that's going to stay.
Okay, what is the word pronounced? Is it divination or divination?
It's like fortune telling. She was demon possessed. The demon gave her supernatural fortune telling powers. Well, I think to annoy Paul and probably to discredit him.
He just thought that she did this for many days.
I know.
I can't believe
He was
she left
patient.
it on that long. Yeah.
How do you even get a demon?
Demons would just come into people and possess them.
That's kind of random.
Not always. Sometimes people get demons by being bad, but sometimes it seems to have been that.
Do you think it still happens today?
I don't think demons can possess people against their will today.
If they're wanting to be possessed, they can.
Maybe. I don't know how all that works. You seem to have had, in the first century, the possibility of someone being possessed by a demon against their will, like a child. We're told today in James 4 we can resist the devil, he'll flee from us, and there is no indication that God continued to give demon casting out powers to people after the first century.
Right.
So, but now I don't know if when people submit to Satan may use demons in his work with them or not. I don't really know. I don't know how all that operates. I don't really care.
Maybe in the same way the Holy Spirit works in us because we
Allow it.
want it or
Yes.
allow it or work toward that goal.
Yes, I think so. This is off the wall completely, but a decent book. If you haven't ever read this, if you like something really off the wall, is C.S. Lewis's The Screwtape Letters, in which what a demon is communicating, or not kind of a master demon is communicating with another demon, giving him the techniques. It's very interesting. It's imaginary, obviously, but it really makes you think about how temptation works. When you start thinking about it from the devil's standpoint and things he's working on and so forth, it really opens your eyes up to some things you might not have thought about before. It's just made up by C.S. Lewis, but if you want to think about demons, it would be a good source.
So do you think the demons possessed them in the first century to show God's power and to prove the work?
I'm okay with that. Although, I think we'd have to add to that a little bit. But I think, yes, since God did give the ability to some people to cast out demons as a confirmation of their message, Jesus seemed to have cast out demons for that purpose, then I would think that'd be one of God's purposes in doing that. We do know that Jesus made reference to, like, if you leave your house swept and unoccupied, it'll be worse demon-possessed than before. I think there were times when demons might enter where they were more or less invited. But there are the times when they entered involuntarily. The only purpose I could see in that is to display the power of God and almost a visual way of depicting Jesus' triumph over Satan. It's one of the signs that were to accompany the believers in Mark 16.
It's another one of those instances where Satan does something, he thinks, oh, I'm doing good, I'm sending demons into them, and then God works good for that.
Isn't God amazing? Mustn't the devil be burning up right now with frustration and chagrin? The devil's been quite persistent, and he's had some pretty good schemes, but the Lord has outsmarted him every single time. 19 to 24.
But when her masters saw that their hope of profit was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace before the authorities. And when they had brought them to the chief magistrates, they said, "These men are throwing our city into confusion, being Jews, and are proclaiming customs which are not lawful for us to accept or to observe, being Romans." And the crowd rose up together against them, and the chief magistrates tore their robes off them and proceeded to order them to be beaten with rods. And when they had inflicted many blows upon them, they threw them into prison, commanding the jailer to guard them securely. And he, having received such a command, threw them into the inner prison and fastened their feet in stocks.
So the masters were really angry. They lost their hope of profit. They lost their source of income, and that makes them drag Paul and Silas before the authorities and try to get something done about this. Of course, what are they going to say? Hey, these guys cast the demon out of this slave girl we were exploiting, and now we can't make any money off of her. You think they're going to take any legal action against Paul because of that? You've got to come up with some kind of accusation that's going to motivate the authorities to take action. So what do they accuse Paul and Silas of?
Throwing the city into confusion.
It's an interesting accusation. Confused things for them, I guess. And what else? Being Romans, they teach customs that aren't lawful for us to observe. Now think about what's going on in this. The real reason they're dragging Paul and Silas before the authorities is because they lost their source of income. Paul touched the sensitive hip pocket nerve, which is a man's most sensitive part of his body. I read this is just a cool way to say it. The most sensitive part of a civilized man is his pocket. So that's what just drives them. And so they bring Paul before the authorities. But they have to say something in a way that the authorities will accept it. So they say these missionaries are foreigners. They're proclaiming these customs not lawful for us Romans to observe. Philippi was a Roman colony. It had a special connection with Rome. They appeal to what you see so much, racial discrimination. We're Romans. They're proclaiming customs not lawful for us Romans to observe. By America. It's amazing how we are. A friend of mine is doing some work on racial prejudice, previous generations in America among brethren. But I ran across something the other day, kind of amazing that this could happen. But it was written in 1907 or 1908, somewhere into there. It's a long time ago. Written by somebody defending this idea that it was right if a black person entered your assembly, if there was a black church nearby, to ask him to leave your assembly and go worship with the black church. And defending with all kinds of arguments that was the right approach to that. Now, I know, but they sounded like they were being very serious and sober about it. You would not be convinced by their arguments, let me tell you, but they were. Isn't it amazing how we sometimes can tend to defend what we feel? And people will use racial issues, ethnic issues a lot of times in history, and even 100 years ago in this country. And there's still some of that. Probably not. I hope not. People trying to say, go worship with your own kind. But certainly, there's some racial superior feelings. That's what they're appealing to. They're Jews. They're proclaiming customs aren't lawful for us Romans to observe. So that's what they say, even though that's not their real reason for opposing them. And so what do the civil authorities do to Paul and Silas?
Put them in prison.
Even before. Can you imagine? And notice verse 23, when they had struck them with many blows. Wow. That would have just been really horrible. Then they throw them in the inner prison, put their feet in the stocks. It's not totally certain whether the stocks were just a security measure or whether they were like a torture thing. That's a possibility. Either way, whoa, this is very this is a horrible situation for Paul and Silas, all because they liberated this poor fortune-telling servant girl. Start doing good for people and watch out, it'll get you in trouble.
Where does Luke leave us?
You won't go on from Philippi. All right, 25 to 30.
But about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns of praise to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. And suddenly there came a great earthquake, so that the foundation of the prison house were shaken. And immediately all the doors were opened and everyone's chains were unfastened. When the jailer awoke and saw that the prison doors were open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself, supposing that the prisoners had escaped. But Paul cried out with a loud voice, saying, "Do not harm yourself, for we are all here." And when he called for the lights and rushed in, and trembling with fear, he fell down before Paul and Silas. And after he brought them out, he said, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?"
All right, so what are Paul and Silas doing in prison about midnight? Can you imagine? Not groans, songs come out of their mouth. He fastened their feet in the stocks, but he didn't gag them. And they were singing praise to God, praying. The prisoners are listening to that. They must do an amazing thing. I wonder how many prisoners had just gotten beaten by rods and were in singing praises to God when they were in prison. Suddenly the earthquake shakes the prison, opens everything up. You would assume the prisoners would have escaped. The jailer awakes, and what's he about to do? Remember 12:19, where the guards that were supposed to have guarded Peter got executed because the angel had released him. So he doesn't want to be executed. He just wants to kill himself. But Paul said, "Don't do that. We're all still here." And he comes in. He says, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" You know, he is so overwhelmed by this. I mean, the earthquake itself and then the fact that they're all still there, I think it just sobers him up and he realizes suddenly his sins and his need for salvation. Pretty amazing turn of events right here.
Do you think he would have been, since like all of them, all the other jail cell people were in there too, and stayed in there, do you think he would have been like knowing that Paul and Silas were from Christ, or would you have just said it to everyone in there?
I assume he knew something about Paul and Silas's background, and he's saying it to them. Paul is the one who cried out to tell him that we're all still here, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
Whenever the earthquake hit, why didn't it open everybody's cells up?
I think because the Lord designed it that way.
We didn't even escape. So I don't know if God wanted them to escape.
Yeah. That's an interesting feature. I don't know why the others didn't wait, but they didn't.
Wait, does it end up saying what the others did? Like the people who were actually supposed to be
Paul
there?
just says, we are all here. That's all we know.
Wait, now what kind of light did they have back then? Like it says Paul light.
Lantern or something like that. Torch. I think it's rather amazing to think that they wouldn't have made allowances for an earthquake. You're supposed to keep the guys in prison even if you get an earthquake. Come on. You know, but the Romans were ruthless. So
They didn't care if it was an angel that let them out.
That's right, you're right, that's true. Go boy.
What kind of an earthquake opens them? Does an earthquake really do that?
Well, I guess an earthquake can rattle things around and open quite a few things up.
Really?
You know, think about it in Haiti. I mean, it just demolished a bunch of buildings. But it can be really severe. It can be devastating. Jail keeper thinking that he would be a dead man because of allowing the prisoners to escape. Tried to kill himself, started to kill himself, but Paul said, "Don't harm yourself. We're all here." He rushes in and he says, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" Obviously, this has been quite an amazing thing to him all the way around, and he's ready to think soberly and seriously now about his life. How about 31 to 34?
And they said, "Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you shall be saved, and you and your household." And he spoke the word of the Lord to him together with all who were in his house. And he took them that very hour of the night and washed their wounds, and immediately he was baptized, he and all his household. And he brought them into his house and set food before them, and rejoiced greatly, having believed in God with his whole household.
Okay, so they say you need to believe in the Lord you and your family to be saved. And they spoke the word of the Lord to him and to his family. And that very hour of the night, wonder what hour of the night that would have been.
About midnight.
Yeah, midnight at the earliest. So midnight or after, and by the time they preached the sermon and so forth, it may have been somewhat after. They washed the wounds of Paul and Silas, and the jailer and his family were baptized. So both the prisoners and the jailer were washed for totally different reasons. Then he brought them into his house, fed them, and rejoiced greatly. This was a wonderful night for this jailer. Now, there's some things that people say about this account that aren't true. And I thought it might be good to take a second and talk about them. A lot of people take verse 31 and they say, all you need to do to be saved is just believe. You don't have to be baptized. What would you say about that?
It says he spoke the word to them, and it caused them to do something. That wasn't the end of the story, just believing.
So the people who think that salvation is by believing alone leave the jail too soon. You know, they don't get the rest of the story. The rest of the story is that when they believe, they do what their faith motivates them to do, and they're baptized. In fact, it doesn't say that the jailer and his family believed until after they'd been baptized. The believing that we know they did is mentioned in verse 34. You know, it's like, there's two ways of believing something. You just got to believe something theoretically, or you can entrust yourself to it and really believe it. In the Bible, when it talks about believing and being saved, it doesn't just mean thinking that it can happen or thinking there's a God. It means giving yourself to God by doing what he tells you to do. If these people, when Paul spoke the word to them, had refused the word, you wouldn't have said they believed. So this passage really shows the urgency of baptism. You know, if it didn't make any difference if you could be saved without it, why not wait till later? Why not wait till morning at least? Why baptize them in the wee hours when it's still dark if it doesn't really make any difference?
You could also go to 1 John and say that you don't need to believe to be saved, because he says whoever confesses that Jesus is the Son of God, God abides in him and he in God. So you don't need to believe either.
Yes. It's another way to look at that is to say there are many different things, and not all of them are in any one passage. Though probably here the truth is when he says believe, he means believing and acting on your faith, and not just believe in the sense of thinking there's a God.
And the things he's asking us to come into a relationship with him, they're both the emotional and the physical aspect. You know, a lot of times the emotion we feel, we then react to that emotion. Our actions come from the emotion we feel. So we come from the believing standpoint of something we feel inside, which is the response why we're baptized. It's the reaction to what the inward feeling. I know the Baptists want to say, well, baptism is an outward response to an inward grace. I don't think that's what it is. It is an outward response to wanting to obey the God that has given you so much.
Some people say, look at verse 33, he was baptized, he and all his household. This proves that babies can be baptized, because he and all his household were baptized, and a lot of households have babies in them. What would you say about that?
That's fine, but you got to preach to them first in verse 32.
And what else in verse 34?
They have to believe.
That's exactly right. I don't know who was in his household, but I know that not only were they baptized, but verse 34, they believed. Well, if they're mature enough to believe, they're mature enough to baptize. I have no doubt about that. That argument in this passage just self-destructs. I don't know. You know, you can look at it two different ways. I mean, my household does not have any babies in it. You know, some do, but not all do. So it may be there weren't any in his household. Who knows? Or it may be that those are obvious exceptions. Well, clearly somebody who's not old enough wouldn't have been. And you wouldn't even have to mention the exception. I don't know which it was. But clearly whoever was baptized were people who'd already believed, according to verse 34. All right, how about 35 and 40?
Now when the day came, the chief magistrates sent the policemen, saying, release those men. And the jailer reported these words to Paul, saying, the chief magistrates have sent to release you. Therefore, come out now and go in peace. But Paul said to them, they have beaten us in public without trial. Men who are Romans and have thrown us in prison. And now are they sending us away secretly? No, indeed. But let them come out themselves and bring us up. The policemen reported these words to the chief magistrates. They were afraid when they heard that they were Romans. When they came and appealed to them, and when they had brought them out, they kept begging them to leave the city. They went out of prison and entered the house of Lydia. And when they saw the brethren, they encouraged them and departed.
They kept them in jail overnight. Well, sort of. I assume they're back in jail. They've made some kind of makeshift locks or whatever. The city officials tell the prisoners to do what? Paul and Silas in this case. To do what? It's over. We'll release you. What would you do if they told you could be released from prison? Yeah. What does Paul do? Stay and say what? I'm not coming out just like that. You want me to come out, you're going to come and talk to me about it. That seems really odd. Why did Paul not accept his release at first? Yeah. And why would they have maybe wanted to keep it quiet?
Because they had beat without reason.
Yes, and they were Roman citizens. That's what Paul mentioned. I don't know if they realized it until this point. Paul said, we're Roman citizens, uncondemned. We were beaten without a trial, and now they want to just send somebody to tell us to leave the prison? They want us to leave, let them come themselves. See, they are in big trouble. They did something you should not do. It'd be like if America had, conquered, South America. The U.S. had conquered South America. And so, South America was an American colony. And, I was in Brazil. And the Brazilians beat me uncondemned without a trial as an American citizen. Ooh, they could be in big trouble. You're a Roman citizen. Rome gives you special privileges, and you don't get whipped with no trial, not being condemned. They really made a big mistake here, not finding out whether they were Roman citizens up front. And Paul is insisting on his rights here. He's making a big deal about what they did. Does that seem like Paul to you, though? Why would he do that? We don't really know the answer. What do you think about this one? Paul is about to leave Philippi. The brethren who are left behind are going to be treated how by the city officials? If Paul makes a big deal about this, and the city officials have to come with egg on their face and beg him to leave, they may be a little more reluctant to engage in some of these unprovoked persecutions against the Christians from here on out. I'm wondering if Paul did this to kind of make the officials less likely to persecute the Christians that are left behind. Now, I know that Paul viewed it as okay to appeal to his legal rights for protection against non-Christians, and he did that sometimes. But here it's almost like he's wanting to make an example to where they don't do those kind of things again, and Paul's leaving. So I think he may be kind of trying to give a little protection to his brethren. I don't know that that's the case, but I would suggest that as a possibility. They do come, and they beg him to leave, and they visit the brethren in Lydia's house, and then move on.
Is that the Lydia from Lydia?
That is.
Do you think they were having a service because the brethren were there?
Maybe, you would think. Maybe there weren't many other brethren other than in Lydia's house. I don't know. Maybe the jailer and his family, but yeah, maybe.
Weren't they cistern instead of brethren?
They might have been. So that's the first place that Paul goes to. And what province? Macedonia. Now we're moving on in Macedonia, chapter 17, verses 1 to 9.